Are you ready to start? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday we had a little bit of a hiccup. The machinery had a bit of a hiccup. We're sorry.
So we're going to have some hiccups today. So
we may have hiccups today.
It works, but
That's what James tells me. Okay. Well, have we started?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to read chapter 11 today from the Dutch House. It also reminds you it's a beautiful day in Burbank. It fell to Sandy to call and tell me Maeve was in the hospital. She had plans to get in and out without you knowing, but that's ridiculous. They say they're probably going to have to keep her in 2 nights. Asking Sandy what the problem was, I could hear the doctor in my voice that studied calm designed to soothe all fear. Tell me what's been going on. What I wanted to do was run out the door to run all the way to Penn Station. She's got this awful-looking red streak gug up her arm. I saw it on her hand, and when I asked her what it was, she told me to mind my own business. So I called Jocelyn, and Jocelyn straightened her out. She came right over, took Maeve to the doctor, and said if Maeve didn't get in the car, she was calling an ambulance. Jocelyn had always been a better bully than me. She could make your sister do things I never could. I couldn't even get Maeve to brush her hair. What did the doctor say? He said she had to go to the hospital right this minute. That's what he said. He didn't even let her go home to pack a bag. That's why she had to call me, so I'd get her things. She made me swear that I wouldn't tell, but I don't care. Does she think I'm not going to tell you she's in the hospital? Did she say how long she's had the red streak? Sandy sighed. She said she'd been wearing sleeves so she wouldn't think about it. It was the middle of the week, so Celeste was at her parents' house in Rydal. I called her from a payphone when I got to Penn Station and told her what time my train was getting in. She picked me up in Philadelphia and drove me to the hospital, dropping me off in the circular driveway out front. Celeste was irritated with Maeve for not pushing me to set up a practice in internal medicine, as though I would have done it if Maeve told me to. She still thought it was Maeve's fault that I'd broken up with her years before and ruined her college graduation. Celeste blamed Maeve for everything she was afraid to blame me for. For her part, Maeve had never forgiven Celeste for insisting I marry her in my first year of medical school. Maeve also believed that Celeste had contrived her appearance at Mr. Martin's funeral, knowing full well she'd run into me there. I disagreed with that. Not that it mattered. What mattered was that Celeste didn't want to see Maeve, and Maeve didn't want to see Celeste. And I just wanted to get out of the car and find my sister. Let me know if you need a ride home, Celeste said. She kissed me before she drove away. It was the 21st of June, the longest day of the year, 8 o'clock at night, and still the sun came shining in through every window on the hospital's west side. The woman at the information desk had given me Maeve's room number and sent me off to do my best. The fact that I had spent the last 7 years of my life in various hospitals in New York in no way qualified me to find my sister's room in a hospital in Pennsylvania. There was no logic to the way any hospital was laid out. They grew like cancers, with new wings metastasizing unexpectedly at the long end of a tunnel. It took me some time to find the general medical floor, and then to find my sister in that undifferentiated area. The door to her room was ajar, and I tapped twice before walking in. She had a double room, but the divider curtain was pushed back, revealing a second bed that was nearly made and waiting. Fair-haired man in a suit sat in the chair beside Maeve's bed. "Oh, Jesus," Maeve said when she saw me. She swore to me that my sister's head that she wouldn't call you. She lied. The man in the suit stood up. It took me just a second, and then I placed him. "Danny?" Mr. Otterson held out his hand. I shook his hand and leaned over to kiss Maeve's forehead. Her face was flushed and slightly damp, and her skin hot. "I'm fine," she said. I could not be more fine. "They're giving you antibiotics." Mr. Otterson pointed to the silver pole with which an ever-collapsing bag of fluid was hung. Then he looked at Maeve. "She needs to rest." "I am resting. What could be more restful than this?" She looked so awkward in the bed, and she was trying out for the role of the patient in a play, but underneath the blanket she would have on her own clothes and shoes. I should be going, Mr. Otterson said. I thought that Maeve would try to stop him, but she didn't. I'll be back Friday. Monday, you think you can't even make it a week without you? You can't, she said. In return, he gave her a smile of great tenderness. Mr. Otterson patted her good hand, then nodded to me and left. We had met many times over the years, and I'd worked in his factory in the summer when I was home from Choate, but he never had a sense of him as being anything other than shy. I could never understand how such a man had grown such a business. Otterson's frozen vegetables now shipped to every state east of the Mississippi, and Maeve told me that with no small amount of pride. If you'd called me first, I would have told you not to come, she said. And if you'd called me first, I would have told you what time I'd be there. I picked up the metal chart that hung from a hook at the foot of her bed. Her blood pressure was 90/60. They were giving her cefalzolin every 6 hours. Are you going to tell me what happened? If you're not going to pursue medicine professionally, then I can see how you're allowed to pursue it personally. I walked around the bed and picked up the hand with the IV. An angry red streak of cellulitis started at the top, cut on the top of her hand. Then it twisted up and around the inside of her arm. Then disappeared into her armpit. Someone had outlined it with a black marker so as to track the infection's progress. Excuse me. Her arm was hot, slightly swollen. When did this start? He said. I have something to tell you. If you'd put down your goddamn arm, I was going to wait until the weekend, but you're here now. I asked her again when it had started. Maybe medical school had done me some good after all. It certainly taught me how to persist with a question that no one saw the point in answering. How did you hurt your hand? I have no idea. And I moved my fingers up to her wrist. Get away from my pulse, she said. Did anyone explain to you how these things go? You get blood poisoning, you become septic, your organs shut down. Maeve worked at clothing drives, food drives, stocking the closets and pantries of the poor on weekends. She was always getting cut, some rogue staple or nail catching her skin. She was bruised by the boxes she loaded into the trunks of waiting cars. Would you stop being so negative? I'm lying in a hospital bed, aren't I? They're pumping me full of antibiotics. I'm not exactly sure what else I'm supposed to be doing. You're supposed to get yourself to the doctor before the infection that started in your hand, before it gets to your heart. It looks like someone ran a paintbrush up your arm. Did you not notice? Do you want to hear my news or not? The anger I felt when she was lying there was unseemly. She had a fever. She could have been in some pain, though I was the last person she would have ever admitted it to. I told myself to stop it or she'd never tell me anything. So I went back to the other side of the bed, sat in the chair, still warm from Mr. Otterson, and I started again. I'm sorry you're sick. She looked at me for a moment, trying to gauge my sincerity. Thank you. I folded my hands in my lap to keep from plucking at her. Tell me your news. I saw Fluffy, she said. I was 29 years old that day in the hospital. Maeve was 36. The last time we'd seen Fluffy, I'd been 4. Where? Where do you think? You've got to be kidding me. It really would have been better if I could have told you this in the car. I had it all planned. We saved our most important conversations for the car. But considering the circumstances, we'd have to make do with the hospital room. The green tile floor, the low acoustical ceiling, the intermittent alert from the public address system that someone was coding. When? Sunday. The top half of her bed was tilted slightly up. She stayed on her back but had turned her head to see me. I'd just gotten out of church, and I thought I'd swing by the Dutch house for a minute on my way home. You live 2 blocks from the church. Don't interrupt. Not 5 minutes later, another car pulls up behind me. A woman gets out and crosses the street. It's Fluffy. How in God's name did you know it was Fluffy? I just did. She's got to be past 50 now, and she's cut off all that hair. It's still red, though, or maybe she dyes it. It's still Fluffy. I remember her so clearly. So did I. You got out of the car? I watched her first. She was standing at the end of the driveway, and I could tell she was thinking it over. Like maybe she was going to walk up and knock on the door. She grew up there, you know, just like us. Well, nothing like us. Maeve nodded into her pillow. I crossed the street. I hadn't set foot on that side of the street since the day we left, and it made me feel a little sick, if you want to know the truth. I kept thinking Andrea was going to come running down the driveway with a frying pan. What did you say? Just her name. I said, Fiona. And she turned around. Oh, Danny, if you could have seen the look on her face. She knew who you were? Maeve nodded, her eyes feverish. She said that I looked like Mommy when she was so young. She said she would have known me anywhere. A young nurse in a white cap came in, and when she saw us there, she sobbed. I was leaning so far over my chin was practically on Maeve's shoulder. Is this a bad time? The nurse said. Such a bad time, Maeve said. The nurse said something else, but we didn't pay any attention. She closed the door behind her, and Maeve started again. Fluffy said she'd just been passing through, and she wondered if we still lived in the house. And you said, no, I just stalked the place. I told her we had left in '63 after Dad died. I shouldn't have said it that way, but I wasn't thinking. As soon as it was out of my mouth, poor Fluffy turned red. Her eyes filled up. I think she was hoping she was going to find him there. I think she'd come to see him. So then what? Well, she was crying, and I didn't want to be standing out there on the wrong side of the street. So I asked her to come sit in my car so we could talk. Shook my head. You and Fluffy parking in front of the Dutch house? In a manner of speaking, Danny, it was the most amazing thing. When she got in the car, we were as close as you and I are now. And the way I felt, I was so incredibly happy, like my heart was going to break open. She was wearing this old blue cardigan, and it was almost like I remembered it. I could have leaned over and kissed her. I've always had it in my mind that I hated Fluffy, that she had hit you and she had slept with Dad. But it turns out I didn't hate her at all. It's like I'm incapable of hating anyone or anything in my life that came before Andrea, and those were the Fluffy days. She still has that pretty face, even now. I don't know if you remember her face, but it was soft, very Irish. All of her freckles are gone now, and she still has those big green eyes. Oh, I said I remembered her eyes. I did a lot of talking at first. Told her about Dad getting married and Dad dying and Andrea throwing you out, and you know what she says. What? She says, what a cunt. Fluffy. Maeve laughed until her cheeks darkened and she started to cough. I'll tell you what, she cut right to it, and I handed her a tissue. She wanted to know all about you. She was impressed that you were a doctor. She kept saying how wild you were, that you couldn't imagine you holding still long enough to read a book, much less study medicine. She's trying to cover her tracks. I wasn't that wild. Yes, you were. Where has she been all this time? Well, she used to live in Manhattan. She said she had no idea what to do that day Dad threw her out. She said she just stood there at the end of the driveway bawling. And finally Sandy walked out and told her she'd call her husband to come and get her. Sandy and her husband took her in. Good old Sandy. She said they'd brainstorm for a few days and finally decided to go to Immaculate Conception and talk to the priest. Old Father Crutcher helped Fluffy find a job as a nanny with some rich people in Manhattan. The Catholic Church helps a woman who was fired for hitting a kid to get a job looking after kids? That's beautiful. Seriously, you've got to stop interrupting me. You're throwing the story off. She gets a good job as a nanny, and while the children were still young, she marries the doorman in the building where she works. She said they kept it a secret until she got pregnant. She didn't want to lose her job. She said the first baby they had was a girl, and that girl is at Rutgers now. And she was on her way to see her. She decided to swing by the old house. No one takes geography anymore. The Dutch house isn't on her way to Rutgers from the city. She lives in the Bronx now, Maeve said, ignoring me. She and her husband. They have 3 children, a girl, and then 2 boys. It took everything in me not to point out that the Dutch house was not on the way to Rutgers from the Bronx either. Fluffy said she checked on the place every now and then, but she couldn't help it. Been her job before we ever moved there. It had been her job to keep an eye on things after Mrs. Van Hobeck died. She said she'd been afraid to go and knock. She didn't know what Dad would say when he saw her, but she'd always hoped she'd run into one of us there. I shook my head. Why did I miss the Van Hobecks after all these years? She asked me if I still had diabetes, and I told her, of course. And then she got upset all over again. I remember Fluffy as being very tough when we were children, but who knows? Maybe she wasn't. She was. She wants to see you. Me? You don't live that far from her. Why does she want to see me? Maeve gave me a look as if to say, surely I was smart enough to get this one myself, but I had no idea. She wants to make amends. Tell her no amends are in order. Listen to me. This is important, and it's not like you're busy. Maeve didn't count the work I was doing on the building as a job. In this way, she and Celeste were in agreement. I don't need to reconnect with someone I haven't seen since I was 4 years old. I'll admit, the story held a certain lurid fascination when it was about Maeve seeing Fluffy, but I had no interest in pursuing a relationship myself. Well, I gave her your number. I told her you'd meet her at the Hungarian pastry shop. That's not going to be any trouble for you. It's not a matter of trouble. I just don't want to do it. My sister yawned extravagantly and pushed her face deeper into the pillow. I'm tired now. You're not getting out of this. Then she looked up at me, her blue eyes rimmed in red. I remembered where we were and why we were there. The overwhelming need to sleep had hit her suddenly. She closed her eyes as if she had no choice in the matter. I stayed in the chair and watched her. I wonder if I needed to be closer to home. Now that my residency was finished, I didn't have to live in New York. I owned 3 buildings, but knew for a fact that perfectly good real estate empires had been made outside of the city. When the doctor came in later to check on Maeve, I stood up and shook his hand. Dr. Lamb, he said. I wasn't much older than me. He must have been my age. Dr. Conroy, I said. I'm Maeve's brother. Maeve didn't stir when he lifted her arms to run his fingers down the track that disappeared into the sleeve of her gown. I first thought she must be faking it, that she wanted to avoid the questions. Then I really realized she was asleep. I didn't know how long Otterson had been there before me, and I'd kept up too long. You should have gotten here 2 days ago, Dr. Lamb said, looking at me. Shook my head. I was the last to know. Well, don't let her snow you. He spoke as if we were alone in the room. This is serious business. He rested her arm at her side, pulled the sheet up over to cover it again. Then he made his mark on the chart and left us there. It's the end of chapter 11.
I'm reading chapter 12 of Ann Patchett's The Dutch House. The completion of my brief medical career had filled me with an unexpected lightness. After I finished my residency, I went through a period in which I was able to see the good in everything, especially the much maligned North End of Manhattan. For the first time in my adult life, I could waste an hour talking to a guy at the hardware store about sealant. I could make a mistake fixing something, a toilet, say, without mortal repercussions. I sanded the floors, painted the walls in one of the empty apartments in my building, and when I was finished, I moved in. By the standards of all the dorm rooms and efficiencies I'd lived in since my extravagant youth, the apartment was generous in size, sunny and noisy, and my own. Owning the place where I lived or having the bank own it in my name plugged up a hole that had been whistling in me for years. Celeste made the curtains in Rydell on her mother's singer and brought them in on the train. She got a job at an elementary school near Columbia and started teaching reading and what they called language arts, while I went to work on other units in the building and then the brownstones. I had no reason to think she'd made peace with my decision, but she had the sense to stop asking me about it. We had stepped into the river that takes you forward. The building, the apartment, her job, our relationship, all came together with irrefutable logic. Celeste loved to tell a softened version of our story, how we had gone separate ways after we separated, after she graduated from college, victims of timing and circumstance, and then how we had found each other again, at a funeral of all places. It was meant to be, she would say, leaning in toward me. So Fluffy was not on my mind. She was not on my mind until the phone rang months after Maeve got out of the hospital. And the voice at the other end said, "Is that Danny?" And I knew, the same way that Maeve had known when she saw Fluffy there on Van Hoobeck Street. I knew that she had taken so long to call because she was trying to work up her courage. And I knew that we would have coffee at the Hungarian pastry shop, whether I wanted to or not. Any energy I expended trying to fight it would be energy lost. There was never a time that the pastry shop wasn't crowded. Fluffy had come early and waited to get a seat in the window. When she saw me coming down the sidewalk, she tapped on the glass and waved. She was standing up when I got to the table. I had wondered if I'd recognize her based on Maeve's description. I had never considered that she might recognize me based on the 4-year-old that I had been. "Could I hug you?" she asked. "Would that be all right?" I put my arms around her because I couldn't imagine how to say no. In my memory, Fluffy was a giant who grew taller over time, when in fact she was a small woman, soft at the edges. She was wearing slacks and the blue cardigan that Maeve had mentioned, or maybe she had more than one blue cardigan. She pressed the side of her face against my sternum for just an instant, and then she let me go. "Whew," she said, and fanned her face with her hand, her green eyes damp. She sat back down at the table in front of her coffee in Danish. "It's a lot. You were my baby, you know. I feel this way whenever I see any of the kids I took care of, but you were my very first baby. Back then, I didn't know you weren't supposed to give your whole heart to a baby that isn't yours. It's suicide. But I was just a kid myself, and your mother was gone, and your sister was sick, and your father. She skipped his descriptive clause. I had a lot of reasons to be attached. She stopped just long enough to drink down half a glass of ice water, then touched the paper napkin to her lips. It's hot in here, right? Or maybe it's me, I'm nervous. She pinched the rounded collar of her blouse away from her neck and fanned it back and forth. I'm nervous, but I'm also that age. I can say that to you, right? You're a doctor, even though you look like you should still be in high school. Are you really a doctor? I am. There was no point into getting into that one. Well, that's good. I'm glad. Your parents would have been proud of you. And can I say something else? I'm sitting here looking at you, and your face is perfectly fine. I don't know what I was expecting, but there isn't a mark on you. I considered pointing out the small scar by my eyebrow, but thought better of it. A waitress I knew named Lizzie, who wore her black curls piled on top of her head with a rubber band, came to the table and put a coffee and a poppy seed muffin down in front of me. Fresh, she said, and walked away. Fluffy watched her retreat with wonder. They know you here? I live close by. And you're handsome, she said. A woman's going to remember a handsome man like you. Maeve says you've got a girl, though, and she doesn't think much of her, in case you didn't know. That's not my business. I'm just glad I didn't wreck your face. The last time I laid eyes on you, you were covered in blood and screaming. Then Jocelyn runs in to take you to the hospital. I thought for sure I'd killed you, all that blood. But you turned out fine. I'm fine. She pressed her lips into the approximation of a smile. Sandy told me you were fine, but I didn't believe her. What else was she going to say? I carried it around with me for years and years. I felt so awful. I didn't stay in touch with any of them, you know. Once I moved to the city, that was it. No looking back. Sometimes you've got to put the past in the past. Sure. Which brings me to your father. She took down the rest of her water. Maeve told me he died. I'm sorry about that. You know you look an awful lot like him, don't you? My kids are mutts, all three of them. They don't look like me or my husband, either one. Bobby's Italian, DiCamillo. Fiona DiCamillo is a mutt name if ever there was one. Bobby never knew about me and your father. She stopped there, a sudden flush of panic rising up her neck. This was a woman whose biology betrayed her at every turn. Emotions stormed across her face with a flag. Maeve told you that, didn't she, about your father and me? She did. Fluffy exhaled, shook her head. My God, I thought I had just put my foot in it. Bobby doesn't need to know about that. You probably don't need to know about it either. But there you go. I was just a kid then, and I was stupid. I thought your father was going to marry me. I slept right there on the second floor in the room next to you and your sister, and I thought it was only a matter of me moving across the hall. Well, ha. The waitresses at the Hungarian pastry shop had to turn sideways to get between the tables, holding their coffee pots high. Everyone was jostled, and the light poured in across the formica tables, and the silverware and the thick white china cups, and I saw none of it. I was back in the kitchen of the Dutch house, and Fluffy was there. That morning, she said, and nodded to make sure I understood which morning we were talking about. Your father and I had a fight, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm not saying it wasn't my fault, but I am saying I wasn't myself. A fight about what? I let my eyes wander over to the pastry case, the pies and cakes, all twice as tall as pies and cakes were meant to be. About our not getting married, he'd never come right out and said he was going to marry me. But what year was it then? 1950? 51? It never crossed my mind that we weren't getting married. I was right there in his bed, if you'll forgive me for saying so. And he got up to get dressed, and I was feeling so happy about things that I said I thought we should start making plans. And he said, making plans for what? Oh, I said, feeling the discomfort of familiarity. Fluffy raised her eyebrows, making her green eyes appear all the larger. If it was just that he wasn't going to marry me, well, that would have been bad enough. But the reason... She stopped and took a bite of her Danish with a fork. Then, bite by bite, she proceeded to eat the entire thing. That was it. Fluffy, who had not stopped talking since I walked in the door, shut down like a mechanical horse in need of another nickel. I waited well past the point of prudence for her to pick it up again. Are you going to tell me? She nodded, her tremendous energy having deserted her. I have a lot to tell you, she said. All ears. She gave me a stern look, the look of a governess to a smart-mouthed child. Your father said he couldn't marry me because he was still married to your mother. That was something I never considered. They were still married. I was willing to be immoral. I think I've established that. I was sleeping with a man I wasn't married to. Okay, fine, my mistake. I'll live with it. But I thought your father was divorced. I never would have gone to bed with a married man. You believe that, don't you? I told her I did, absolutely. What I didn't tell her was that a man who wants to sleep with a pretty young nanny across the hall never has any intention of marrying her. What better lie to tell her he's still married? My father wasn't much more of a Catholic than I was, but he was too Catholic to be a bigamist, and Andrea was too smart to marry a bigamist, and Lawyer Gooch was too thorough to have overlooked such a detail. I never would have done anything against your mother. I liked your father fine, I did. He was handsome and sad, and all those nonsense things girls think are so important at that age. But Elna Conroy was my heart. I never saw myself filling her shoes. No one could have done that. But I meant to take care of you and your sister and your father the way she would have wanted. She was so worried about you before she left. She loved the three of you so much. Before there was a chance to formulate all the questions there were to be asked, I felt a strong hand on my shoulder. Danny, you got a day off. Dr. Abel was beaming. I should be seeing more of you now that your residency is finished, not less. I've been hearing rumors. Fluffy and I were sitting at a foretop. There were 2 empty places set with silverware and napkins that I hoped he had the sense to overlook. Dr. Abel, I said, this is my friend Fiona. Maury. Dr. Abel leaned across the table to shake her hand. Fluffy. Maury Abel smiled and nodded. Well, I can see you two are busy. Danny, you won't make me have to track you down, will you? I won't. Say hello to Mrs. Abel for me. Mrs. Abel knows who owned those parking lots, he said, and laughed. You may not get an invitation to Thanksgiving this year. Good, Fluffy said to him. Then Danny can come and have Thanksgiving with us. When he walked away from the table, Fluffy seemed to understand that our time at the Hungarian pastry shop was not infinite. She decided to get to the point. You know your mother's here, don't you? I've seen her. Lizzie sailed past, tipping her coffee pot in my direction. I shook my head while Fluffy held up her cup for more. What? It was a cold wind coming in the door. She's dead, I wanted to say. Surely she's dead by now. I couldn't tell your sister. I couldn't make her diabetes worse. Knowing where your mother is doesn't make diabetes worse, I said, trying to apply logic to a conversation where no logic existed. Fluffy shook her head. It certainly can. You don't remember how sick Maeve was. You were too young. Your mother would come and go and come and go, and when she finally left for good, Maeve nearly died. That's just a fact. After that, your father told her she could never come home again. He wrote her a letter when Maeve was in the hospital. I know that. He told her she'd all but killed the two of you. The two of us? Well, she said, not you. He only threw you in to make her feel worse. If you ask me, he was trying to get her to come back. He just went about it wrong. Had anyone asked me an hour before this meeting how I felt about my mother, I would have sworn I had no feelings on the subject, which made it difficult to understand the enormity of my rage. I held up my hand to stop Fluffy from talking for a second, just to give my brain the chance to catch up. And she raised her hand and touched her palm lightly to mine, as if we were measuring the length of our forefingers. Maybe because he was sitting with a student 2 tables away, a boy around the age I must have been when we were first met. I saw myself standing in the door of Maury Abel's office. No parents, he asked. Where is she now? I was suddenly struck by the possibility that my mother was going to walk in the Hungarian pastry shop and pull up a chair, that this entire reunion was a setup for some horrific surprise. I don't know where she is now. I saw her more than a year ago, maybe 2. I'm bad with time. I'm sure it was in the Bowery, though. I looked out the window of a bus, and there she was, Elna Conroy, standing there like she was waiting for me. It almost stopped my heart. I exhaled, my own heart starting again. You mean you saw someone who looked like my mother when you were on a bus? The idea of anyone you know out the window of a bus seemed far-fetched, but I never took the bus, and when I did, I don't suppose I ever looked out of the window. Fluffy rolled her eyes. Jesus, I'm not an idiot, Danny. I got off the bus. I went back and found her. And it was her? Elna Conroy, who had run off to India in the night, leaving her husband and 2 sleeping children, was in the Bowery? She was just the same, I swear it. Her hair's gone gray and she wears it in a braid now, the way Maeve used to. They both have that ridiculous hair. Did she remember you? I haven't changed that much, Fluffy said. I was the one who had changed. Fluffy dumped her coffee into her water glass and let the ice melt. The first thing she asked about was you and Maeve. And since I didn't know, there was nothing I could tell her. I didn't even know where you lived. The shame of it all came back on me like the whole thing had happened yesterday. I'll never get over it. To think I'd been fired, to think why I'd been fired, and that I hadn't stayed to look after you the way I'd promised her I would. Her grief hung between us. We were her children. It seems like she should have stayed and looked after us herself. She's a wonderful woman, Danny. She had a terrible time of it. A terrible time of it living in the Dutch house? Fluffy looked down at her empty plate. This wasn't her fault. Even if she'd hit me, even if she'd thrown out because of it. There was very little forgiveness in my heart, and what I had I gave to Fluffy. There was no way for you to understand, she said. She couldn't live like that. She's doing her penance down there serving soup. She's trying to make up for what she's done. Who is she making it up to? To me? To Maeve? Fluffy considered this. To God, I guess. There's no other reason she'd have been in the Bowery. I, who had bought property in Harlem and Washington Heights, would not have touched the Bowery with a stick. When did she leave India? Fluffy tore open 2 sugar packets, added them to her iced coffee, and stirred. I wanted to tell her the whole thing would have gone better if she'd put the sugar in the coffee while the coffee was still hot. In fact, I wanted to tell her it would have been infinitely preferable to get together to discuss how sugar dissolves. A long time ago. She said it had been years and years. She said the people had been very kind to her. Can you imagine? She would have been happy to stay there, but she had to go where she was needed, which wasn't Elkins Park. She gave up everything. That's what you have to understand. She gave you up and your sister and your father and that house so she could help the poor. She's lived in India and God knows however many other horrible places. She was down there on the Bowery. The whole place stinks, you know. It's foul down there, the trash and the people. And your mother's serving soup to junkies and drunks. If that's not being sorry, I don't know what it is. I shook my head. That's being delusional, not sorry. I wish I could have talked to her more, Fluffy said. Her feelings clearly hurt. But I was going to be late for my job. I'm a baby nurse now. I get in and get out before I get too attached. And to tell you the truth, the bums were crawling all over the place, and I didn't feel so comfortable standing there on the street. Just as soon as I had that thought, she told me she was going to walk me to the bus stop. She put her arm in mine like we were 2 old friends. She told me she'd be working down there for a while, and that I could come back and serve if I wanted to, or just come back and visit. I kept thinking I'd go see her again on my day off, but Bobby wasn't having it. He said I had no business making lunch for a bunch of guys on the Needle. I sat back in my chair trying to take it in. I was glad Maeve didn't come to the city. I didn't want her looking out a bus window and seeing our mother on the street. Do you know where she is now? She shook her head. I should have tried to find you sooner so I could have told you. It wouldn't have been hard. I feel bad about that. I motioned to Lizzie for the check. If my mother had wanted to see us, she would have found us herself. Like you said, it wouldn't have been hard. Fluffy was twisting the paper napkin in her fingers. Believe me, I know what a bad time everyone went through. I was there. But your mother has a higher calling than we do. That's all. I put my money on the table. Then I hope she enjoys it. When I looked at my watch, I realized I was already late. I'd scheduled a meeting with a contractor as a means of ensuring my time with Fluffy would be limited. She walked with me 2 blocks before it became clear she was going in the wrong direction. She took my hand. "We'll do this again, won't we?" she said. "Maeve has my number. I'd like to see you both. I want you to meet my kids. They're great kids, like you and your sister." Maeve was right. Not only was it remarkable to see Fluffy again, but I felt a complete absence of anger toward her. She had been in an impossible situation. No one would say that what had happened had been her fault. "Would you leave them?" "Who?" "Your great kids," I said. "Would you walk away and leave them now and never let them know you were still alive? Would you have left them before they were old enough to remember you? Left them for Bobby to raise on his own?" I could see the blow travel through her, and she took a step away from me. "No," she said. "Then you're the good person," I said, "not my mother." "Oh, Danny," she said, and her voice caught in her throat. She hugged me goodbye. When she walked away, she turned back to look at me so many times she appeared to be going up the sidewalk in a loose series of concentric circles. The fact of the matter was, I had seen my mother too, though I hadn't known it at the time. As I walked to 116th Street after leaving Fluffy, I had no doubt that it had happened. It had been in the emergency room at Albert Einstein around midnight, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3. All the chairs in the waiting room were full. Parents held half-grown children in their laps, paced with children in their arms. People were propped up against the walls, bleeding and moaning, vomiting into their laps. A standard Saturday night in the Gun and Knife Club. I had just scoped a young woman with a crushed airway, a steering wheel, a boyfriend. And once I got the endoscope down past her nasal passages, both of her vocal cords were collapsed. Blood and spit were bubbling in every direction, and it took forever to get the endotracheal tube in place. When I finished the procedure, I went to the waiting room to look for whoever had brought her in. As I called the name on the chart, a woman behind me tapped my shoulder and said, "Doctor." Everyone did that, the sick and those advocating for the sick. They chanted and begged, "Doctor, nurse, doctor, nurse." The emergency room at Albert Einstein was a cyclone of human need, and the trick was to keep focused on the thing you'd come to do, ignoring the rest. But when I turned around, the woman looked at me with such, surprise? Fear? I remember raising my hand to my face to see if there was blood on it. That had happened before. She was tall and dismally thin, and in my mind I assigned her to the ash heap of late-stage lung cancer or tuberculosis. None of this distinguished her in that particular crowd. The only reason she'd stuck with me at all was because she called me Cyril. I would have asked her how she knew my father, but then a man was there saying it was his girlfriend I had just scoped. I was taking him into the hallway, wondering if he in fact had strangled her. I'd been in the waiting room for less than a minute, and by the time I had the chance to wonder about the woman with the gray braid who had called me by my father's name, she was long gone, and I was no longer interested. I didn't wonder if she'd been a tenant in one of the Conroy buildings, or if she was someone he had known in Brooklyn. I certainly never thought about my mother. Like everyone else who worked in an ER, I pressed ahead with what was right in front of me and made it through the night. To grow up with a mother who had run off to India, never to be heard from again, that was one thing. There was closure in that, its own kind of death. But to find out she was 15 stops away on the #1 train to Canal and had failed to be in touch was barbaric. Whatever romantic notions I might have harbored, whatever excuses or allowances my heart had ever made on her behalf, blew out like a match. The contractor was waiting for me in the lobby when I got back, and we talked about the window frames that were pulling away from the brick in the front of the building. He was still there taking measurements an hour later when Celeste came home from school. She was so buoyant, so bright, her yellow hair tangled from the wind that had kicked up. She was telling me about the children in her class and how they had all cut out leaves from construction paper and printed their names on the leaves so she could make a tree on her classroom door. And as I listened, less to what she was saying and more to the pleasing sound of her voice, I knew that Celeste would always be there. She had proven her commitment to me time and again. If men were fated to marry their mothers, well, here was my chance to buck the trend. "Ah," she said, dropping her book bags on the floor and reaching up to kiss me. "I'm talking too much. I'm like the kids. I get all wound up. Tell me about the grown-up world. Tell me about your day." But I didn't tell her anything. Not about the pastry shop or Fluffy or my mother. I told her instead, I'd been thinking. I thought it was time we got married. It's the end of chapter 12. Mary Lynn Grant will be reading chapter 13.